Why did Satan incite the Romans to crucify Jesus if he knew exactly who Jesus was? And particularly if he knew that doing so would open him up to being plundered. Now, most people look at this and they reason out, well, clearly Satan didn't know who Jesus was. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done that, right? And they'll frequently point to things like the temptation of Jesus, where Satan's constantly saying, if you are the Son of God, do this, right? And they'll use this as sort of the evidence to back up the idea that Satan clearly just didn't know. There's just one problem. We know that the demons knew exactly who Jesus was, because every single time he encountered demons, they said, "Are you here to torment us before the appointed time?" Which not only indicates that they knew who he was, but they also understood that there was an appointed time for them to be judged by him. But that's not the only reason to think he knew. If you look at the temptation of Jesus, there's something very interesting about the way Satan approaches it. The first two temptations are sort of like an instigation almost. It's like, if you are actually who you say you are, then do this thing. But the final temptation, he completely shifts gears and he goes right to the point. Worship me and I'll give you all the things that you came for, which is the kingdoms of the earth. Because Jesus came to be appointed king. That's the whole reason he came, was to take possession of what was always going to be his. Now, I talked about this more extensively in another video. You can go check that out. It's about 2 videos back. But what I wanted to point out here was specifically the concept of whether Satan knew who Jesus was, because this is something I had a lot of people bring up on that other video. And more specifically, to answer the question of, if he did know who he was, then why on earth would he have the Romans kill him? Like, if Satan knew exactly who Jesus was, surely he would have known that there's no way that death is going to be able to lay hold of him because of who he is. So what's the play here, right? You have to remember, Satan knows that God is more powerful than him. That means that at any point in time, God could snap his fingers and say, okay, I'm done with this charade. All of your authority, all of your power, gone. Jesus, you're appointed king, the end, right? Satan had to know this. So if Satan is still playing a game that he knows on a front of power, there's no possible way he can win, then what game is he actually playing? What is his actual aim? And I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, he's just so egotistical that, he still thinks he can win. But I just don't think that adds up. Satan is called the most cunning of all of God's creation. Satan's not stupid. Satan clearly is extremely intelligent and extremely strategic. So if he's not stupid, even with an extreme ego, there's no way he thinks he's going to beat God on power. I mean, he already lost on trying to wage war against the armies of heaven. So at this point, he's bound to know that in a firefight, there is no situation where he's going to win. I mean, even just taking Jesus off the map in the physical sense, even that by itself seems odd, because Satan would have known that God is more than capable of raising him from the dead. But he already did it with Lazarus. Jesus himself rose someone from the dead with Lazarus. So in what universe would he think that killing Jesus is going to accomplish anything in the physical sense, because God could just bring him back? The more you look at this narrative, the more you realize that our assumptions about the game that Satan is playing don't really add up. At least until you take a big step back and look at this from more of a 100,000-foot view. I want you to go on a little journey with me through history, okay? So all throughout human history, you have Satan being called the accuser of the brethren. And then we have this very interesting story in Job, where Satan is roaming about the earth looking for something, apparently. And God says to him, what have you been up to? And he's like, roaming to and fro. And then the Lord says, have you considered my servant Job? Now that statement, have you considered? And Satan's response to that. Satan immediately goes, yeah, I know about Job. But Job is that way because you take care of him, protect him, and all this other stuff, right? That whole little interaction suggests that Satan was roaming about the earth for a very particular purpose. And if you pair the fact that he's persistently called the accuser of the brethren with the whole scenario with Job, the picture that we start to get is Satan is roaming around looking for people that he can use to accuse God of something. Now, I think there's 2 possible things that Satan's trying to accuse God of here. And one of them I tend to lean more towards the other, but I think they're both probably in play to some degree. The first one, I think, he's trying to accuse God of injustice for judging the angels, but still giving certain humans a free pass. The second one, however, I think is the primary and has more explanatory power in kind of the whole narrative of why Satan is doing any of what he's doing in the first place. Which is, I think he is trying to find a way to disqualify humanity from becoming the children of God the way that God intends for them to be. Now, we know that as human beings, we were made lower than the angels. But the intention of God was to raise us above the angels. And we know that because Paul says that we're going to judge the angels. We know that Jesus is the archetype, also made a little lower than the angels in the physical sense. When he entered into the earth, he made a little lower than the angels, or positioned a little lower than the angels. But then he was appointed above the angels as a result of his obedience and righteousness to the Father, which archetypes how we too also were made a little bit lower than the angels in our human form. But the intention of God was to first conform us to the image of his Son in character, and then likewise after death conform us to the image of his Son in body, which places us to be higher than the angels, where we would then rule and reign with Christ and subsequently judge the celestial beings. Now, if you put all this together, it begins to explain why Satan might have such a huge problem with humanity. Because if you are one of the most powerful or beautiful beings in the celestial sphere, and then God creates this new creation that is intellectually inferior to you, that is physically inferior to you, that in all respects has the appearance of being inferior to you, and the intention is for that thing to then grow up and become your superior, that might be cause for a rebellion or a mutiny. Which brings us back to, what game was Satan playing when he incited the Romans to crucify Christ? What did he stand to gain by doing that? Because he knows that any type of physical assault that he puts on Jesus is not going to be permanent. God could simply raise him from the dead. So he couldn't possibly have thought that if I take him off the map, that means he's off the map permanently. He couldn't possibly have thought that taking Jesus off the map would mean that he got to lay claim to his soul, because again, God the Father has the ability to do whatever he wants. So what exactly did Satan think he was going to accomplish by taking Jesus off the map? This is where we have to understand his motive and what it is he's been trying to accomplish since the very beginning. Ever since Adam, I believe Satan has been trying to disqualify mankind from coming into the position that God has appointed them to. From day one, he has been the accuser of the brethren, and the whole premise of his attack was to demonstrate to both God and the rest of the angels that humanity is unqualified for the position that they're being appointed to. This is the reason that he wanted to test Job and show that if God lifted his protections, that Job would have cursed God. This is the reason why he wanted to sift Peter and the rest of the disciples, to once again prove that when the heat is on, mankind will always abandon God, making them not qualified to be his children who would ultimately rule over the angels. So with this as our lens, I would like to propose that the entire gambit that Satan was playing with Jesus' crucifixion was the ultimate disqualification.